looking at crayfish surveys in Lake Huron. So just by way of brief background, I was asked to give this presentation at the technical committee meeting this last winter, and really this topic started I guess the winter before that. We had presented some information on our crayfish assessments, and really there began a discussion on what the surveys were telling us. Were they telling us the same thing? So anyway, put this talk together for today, and just to point out that I think we, being USGS internally, and as well the tech committee, are starting to look at crayfish surveys in Lake Huron and trying to address whether they are providing us with the most pressing critical needs of fishery managers. That's really the focus of today's talk. And just to acknowledge a number of co-authors here who are involved in crayfish assessments on Lake Huron. So a brief presentation overview. So I'll start out with a little bit of historical context of the USGS crayfish assessments. I'll talk about the current USGS Lake Huron surveys. Now, some of this information was presented in the previous talk, so I'll move through this kind of quickly. I don't want to be too duplicative here. I'll focus on identifying the role of crayfish surveys in Lake Huron. And then the last two bullets here I'll kind of cover in the last couple slides, and that's how identifying critical information needs from crayfish assessments, and then looking at potential future directions. So the current trawling program that the USGS conducts on all of the Great Lakes, really you have to look to the 1960s in Lake Michigan when this program was established. So in 1962, there was a single trawl transect established in Saugatuck, Michigan. This catch, I believe, is actually from around that area. This transect has been sampled every year since. By 1973, there was bottom trawling programs that had been established on both Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. These surveys had multiple ports that were sampled annually. They followed a fixed site survey design. It's important to point out that these trawl stations and these transects were located near major ports, and this is for a number of reasons. We had larger to mid-sized fishery vessels, and so we had good dockage provided there. And also a lot of the original transects and where they were established was based on knowledge of commercial fish catches, and so that's really what drove the location of some of these transects. So the 12-meter head rope bottom trawl, which was towed for 10 minutes, was the standard unit of sampling. And in fact, on Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, and Lake Ontario, it is still the standard unit. In 1991, Lake Huron switched to a 21-meter trawl. I think it's really important to look back to see what condition the lakes were in during this time. So when the trawl surveys were established, the ecosystems were largely degraded, alewife proliferated. The management focus was on invasive species control, but also the establishment and maintenance of recreational fisheries. Now, certainly the management focus remains on recreational fisheries, but I think that first objective has shifted a little bit over time, certainly for Lake Huron. The daytime bottom trawling program then really became the standard monitoring program for all of the Great Lakes. So they were really founded or based on this daytime bottom trawling. We knew that bottom trawl surveys had limitations, however. Really early on, both Dreyer and Wells knew that some proportion of crayfish were located above trawl paths during the day. Argyle took this a bit further. 20 to 30% of the biomass of crayfish were located above the trawl path. So we knew really very early on that really through multiple gears is how we're going to be able to adequately assess crayfish populations and fish communities. So a number of papers here over the years have sort of looked at this a little more critically. So luckily for us, about this time, we started seeing pretty substantial advances in acoustic technologies. Well, these are in particular acoustic technologies used to measure backscatter from marine and freshwater organisms. So acoustic surveys then were sort of utilized, and actually these surveys were first begun, or at least the exploratory acoustic work was done right about the time that these trawl surveys began. So in the early 1970s, early to mid 1970s, the first acoustic work was done in Lake Huron. And then in 1997 was the first synoptic survey of Lake Huron. And if you saw from the previous talk, we have that single data point from 1997. This kind of serves as our reference or our benchmark year to compare to the current time series. The current prey fish sampling program that the USGS operates is mandated through a Council of Lake Committee's US Geological Survey Memorandum of Agreement. This is signed annually under a 5-year MOU. For Lake Huron, this includes both the acoustic and the bottom trawl surveys. So this obligates us to conduct these surveys annually to maintain a high degree of data integrity in the collection of these important data. And also the timely reporting of this information, which is typically done here at the March Lake Committee meetings. So just drawing from the MOA, a little bit of the language here just spells out the objectives of the Deepwater Fish Ecology and Assessment Studies, which is our program at the USGS, is to provide scientific information and fulfillment of research needs of managers to understand and effectively manage each of the Great Lakes. So just to profile the surveys, and again, a little bit of this information was also already covered, so I don't want to dwell too much on it. So the Integrated Acoustic and Midwater Trawl Survey, 14-year time series. This survey typically takes 1 month to complete. We sample depths from 15 to 200 meters of water on average. Again, survey coverage, all 3 basins of Lake Huron. Target species, bloater, rainbow smelt, cisco, emerald shiner, and other pelagic species. So a typical survey looks something like this, where we see a widespread distribution of transects and trawls here, shown by these green triangles. One of the key differences between these two surveys, we consider the acoustic survey actually like a late summer survey. The lake is well stratified during this time. And of course, all of the work occurs at night. And I'll contrast that with the bottom trawl survey. So this is our long time series. Typically 3 weeks to complete this survey. We sample 9 to 110 meters, as Daryl mentioned. Important to point out, there's a single 110-meter trawl site in the current design. So we have this mixture of benthic species, as well as benthopelagic or the semi-pelagic species. You just saw this map previously, but just to point out, this is our traditional fall survey occurring in mid to late October into early November. So the key difference is really has to do in terms of lake conditions, is that when this survey begins, we usually see the lake still well stratified. But during the course of this survey, we actually see almost complete turnover of the lake, at least out to 60 or 70 meters. The lake is changing usually during this time of year, just based on weather systems. So these surveys, as I think I've highlighted here, these surveys use different gears and they sample different lake areas. So they should not be expected to provide the same information in terms of the same numbers. And we use this word complementary a lot, but really just to point out that these two surveys and 2 different types of gears in lake areas provide a more complete or comprehensive understanding of the status of prey fish on an annual basis. As we know, with any kind of biological sampling program, It's difficult to adequately assess all life stages and all species with a single gear. And in particularly with fisheries, when we have stocks that are semi-pelagic, like some of the species that we sample, I've referred to these also as benthopelagic, that migrate throughout the water column, a single technique is difficult. So looking at some of the advantages and the limitations of these surveys, certainly with acoustics, sampling occurs over all offshore habitat types. We have larger spatial coverage than the standard trawl survey. The stratified random design that we use on this survey allows us to be more adaptive to annual variation in biomass. So we allocate acoustic effort in those regions that I showed in the previous talk based on variability from previous years. So where there's more variation, usually on a 2 to 3 year running average, if there's more variation in biomass, more effort. We have limitations with gear selectivity. Spatial bias, although we have broad scale coverage of the lake, we know that this is still relatively small compared to the whole lake of the surface area of Lake Huron, which exceeds or is around 60,000 square kilometers. We know not all fish are available to the midwater trawl tow, so issues with limitations based on availability. Also selectivity and availability issues in terms of the acoustic equipment. So what we refer to as blind zones or upper blind zones occur near the vessel, near the transducer, so where we are not able to insonify targets based on the beam pattern close to the vessel. Also have acoustic dead zones that occur very near the lake bottom where we can't distinguish individual targets. And trawls are required for species identification, so acoustics can be very informative for surveying large areas of the lake, but we need trawls to give us information on species composition, and we use a combination of target strength and trawls. I talked a little bit about fish availability. This is kind of an example here. This is actually a section of an echogram. I believe this is from North Channel. A fairly typical distribution of rainbow smelt. We see a lot of the fish here are nicely distributed up through the water column. So these would all be available to the midwater trawl and to the acoustic equipment. But we also notice a number of fish are very tight to the bottom along this bank and up along this portion. These fish are not available to the midwater trawl, and most of them would not be available if they're very close to the bottom, available to the acoustic equipment. Advantages of bottom trawl surveys. We have this long temporal scale, so there's this huge value in terms of historical data, in terms of fish community monitoring. This is also considered more of a true fish community index, so we're sampling both benthic and benthopelagic species. One possible advantage of a fixed site, this has been shown for a lot of large river systems, is the detection of changes in CPE. May be easier to detect changes in CPE than a random design. We do know that the size of these systems may limit this, and to point out that changes in catch per unit effort are for these specific locations that we sample annually. As far as gear limitations, we know there's also issues with selectivity of bottom trawls. We generally have a poor understanding of this in the Great Lakes. There's habitat bias. Trawl areas are limited to flat areas, softer substrates, areas where we don't tear up nets. There's spatial bias. We know this, similar to the acoustic surveys, that the trawl stations are located in one portion of the lake, relatively small compared to the entire lake. Now, that being said, the depth habitat sampled by bottom trawls is fairly comprehensive and is roughly 80% of the depth strata that are in Lake Huron. Maybe a limitation of fixed sites. As we've seen fish populations become more variable over time, more patchy, a fixed site may not account for the fish migration and the fish aggregations that we see in certain areas of the lake. And also availability, I've already talked a little bit about this. It's a component of catchability, and that some species and life stages are located above the trawl path. A recent paper by Ono et al., I think, illustrates this nicely. You can see here what we refer to as the bottom trawl blind zone. So this entire area of the water column above the trawl, these fish would all be unavailable to it, to the trawl. The beam pattern here coming off the vessel, you can see most of these fish are available to the transducer. This is just an illustration here of the acoustic dead zone that occurs very close to the bottom. Another thing I haven't talked about is fish behavior around vessels. This is also something we don't know a lot about. We do know, and we have some evidence that fish react to our vessels, even at great depths. So just showing here some diving happening by these fish. So the role of both of these surveys is to measure the relative abundance, density, and biomass of the offshore prey fish community. We've talked about that. Certainly evaluating long-term population dynamics, providing lake managers with estimates of prey abundance that are potentially available to predators. And I use the word potentially because we sample these lakes during a very discrete time during the year. For example, the acoustic survey is just during September. So we can't really account for predation, other forms of mortality that occur after that throughout the year. So trying to make predictions on availability of prey fish for the following year can be limited. And not a lot of information on this today's talks, but we've also continued to obviously collect information on basic biological information, but also age structure of these populations. It's important to note that these estimates are considered indices of relative abundance. We feel that an additional role of the acoustic surveys, Daryl showed some nice information today looking at spatial distributions based on trawl catches, but one additional role of acoustic surveys is providing this better understanding of variation in fish distribution, in fish biomass. We can see areas like this where we see very high densities of fish, contrasted with areas like this where we see fairly low densities and low biomass. We've seen a couple of these today just showing these spatial patterns in fish dynamics. So we sort of developed this list, and this list is kind of based on some of the value that we've seen in long-term fish community monitoring. Most of this is based on the long-term trawl survey, the bottom trawl survey. We've learned about recruitment of wild lake trout in the main basin of Lake Huron, diet and heritage strain of wild lake trout. Certainly important being the collapse of alewife populations were first detected with bottom trawl surveys and corroborated with acoustic assessments happening at the same time. Information on native benthic fishes like deepwater sculpin, the first documented diet study in Lake Huron, other native species like emerald shiner, long-term trends in rainbow smelt recruitment, effects of environmental factors, and then also some work from our acoustic surveys looking at drivers of pelagic fish spatial variability. So I'll kind of cover these last two bullets in the last few slides here. So as I was asked to put this together for the technical committee meeting, I started thinking pretty long and hard and talking with colleagues about sources of how critical needs are identified for our trawl surveys. I've spoken a little bit about this in terms of the memorandum of agreement. But I think I drew really from some of the more obvious sources of this information. We look at Lake Huron research priorities. These are identified by the technical committee initially. There's some information on there that's germane to prey fish assessment. Also, specific partner requests. This is another way that we identify the critical needs of partner agencies. A recent study with Jim Bentz et al. At the Quantitative Fisheries Center looking at predator-prey modeling. So this is utilizing our long-term trawl survey and using age-structured models for prey fish and predators. And then finally, the prey fish community objective for Lake Huron. And I've looked at this a number of times, and you know, it's fairly general with regards to prey fish, that really calling to maintain this diversity of prey species at population levels matched to predator demand and primary production. So just an example that I kind of threw together here for the technical committee was how might we tackle some of these limitations if they were identified as sort of critical needs. And one of the limitations, I know this has been addressed a number of times, is really linked to some of the spatial bias. So we have generally a lack of near shore sampling. We consider this maybe less than 20 meters of water. Now, typically our surveys are designed to sample offshore areas, so this is, but this is still recognized. There are parts of the lake that we cannot sample. So a lot of the cause of this is the draft of our vessels. We know acoustics can be problematic in shallow water. One of the potential solutions is small vessel work and interagency coordination to include some of these undersampled areas. Now, the Department of Natural Resources has been monitoring the fish community of Saginaw Bay for some time and has valuable information on changes in that portion of Lake Huron. But one example would be, should we include acoustic survey estimates of Saginaw Bay in our lake-wide estimates? So this list has kind of been pulled together. This is a list of potential future directions of some issues that have come up at both the technical committee level and in internal discussions. And really, a lot of these are based on some of the limitations that I spoke of today. So utilizing acoustics to better delineate Cisco stocks in Lake Huron, use of targeted trawl surveys and new technology to sample round goby. This is some work Daryl touched on. This is ongoing work. Measurements of catchability. Further research on trawl selectivity. Dave Warner at our lab has led some pretty important work looking at selectivity of acoustics and trawls using simulated fish communities. How is this information comparing to what we see in the lake during surveys? Collection of seasonal production data. So our surveys are really targeted at fall periods. A lot of this is based on when fish are recruiting to trawls. So these surveys were set up as fall surveys so we can index the young of year. Is seasonal production data important? Leveraging existing surveys to collect higher resolution data. Add transects to address spatial bias. Add deeper trawl stations as part of our standard trawl survey. And lastly here, emerging technologies combined with autonomous options to address spatial bias. So this would be taking existing surveys and pairing these with some of the autonomous and emerging technology work that's being done by folks at our lab and other areas. So I'd like to just kind of boil this down to some take-home messages. We know that limitations exist with prey fish assessments, but there are tools to address these. We feel that there is still introspection needed from managers and researchers to identify what the critical needs are. And a few questions here that hopefully will stimulate some of this introspection. Do existing surveys need to be augmented in time and space? What impact has the changing ecology of Lake Huron food web had on trawl surveys or the information that these surveys provide? What is the optimal suite of tools to address survey limitations and then effectively sample Lake Huron given their current ecosystem dynamics? And lastly, have the critical needs of managers changed with the changing ecology of the lake? So with that, hopefully I have some time for questions.